If you have never lived at that altitude, you will never truly understand what cold is. It is not the winter wind on a Minnesota night, nor the icy water of the North Atlantic. It is a dead stillness at -50 degrees Celsius, a kind of emptiness at the edge of the atmosphere. At 30,000 feet, the sky is no longer the gentle blue we used to look up at from the farms in Kansas. It turns into a depth of violet that makes the heart tremble, and even at noon you can faintly see the stars. That is God's domain, or the front yard of the devil. My name is Thomas Reynolds. When the war ended, I was a major in the U.S. Army Air Force's 20th Air Force, 73rd Bombardment Wing. But I always preferred to think of myself as an operator, the chief operator of a precision instrument weighing 60 tons, made of aluminum alloy, plexiglass, and 4 Wright R3350 engines. Years later, when historians leaf through the archives of the Second World War, they like to talk about Bushido, about kamikaze pilots, or the meat grinder of Iwo Jima. But to those of us who sat in the pressurized cabins of a B-29, the outcome of the Pacific War had already been decided the moment the first rivet was driven into the skin of the fuselage. This was never truly a contest of courage, though neither side lacked courage. It was a one-sided slaughter carried out with thermodynamics, aerodynamics, and industrial capacity. Sitting in that cockpit that smelled of ozone and rubber, watching the needle of the altimeter rest steady at 30,000 feet, I would look down through the plexiglass. Down there, in that low-altitude world of heavy air and crushing drag, the best pilots of the Japanese Empire were flying the fighters they were so proud of, the Ki-61 Heian or the Ki-44 Shoki, trying to break the shackles of physical law. Watching them struggle 2,000 feet below us, gasping for lift like fish out of water, stalling and falling away, I felt a pity that was almost cruel. That was the gap in technology. We were not really fighting them. We were using the engineering miracles of the 1940s to crush an opponent still chained to the industrial logic of the end of the First World War. This is my story. Or rather, the story of how industrial civilization strangled the warriors of an older age. In the spring of 1942, at Randolph Field in San Antonio, Texas, if the Japanese trained their pilots the way you forge a hereditary samurai sword, hand-picked from afar, worked over and polished, emphasizing personal intuition and man-machine oneness, then the way the U.S. Army Air Forces trained us was more like Detroit turning out Ford Model Ts. Before I entered flight school, I was a sophomore mechanical engineering student at Caltech. That wasn't unusual at the time. Among my classmates were a dropout from MIT, a mechanic from Detroit, and farm machinery operators from the Midwest. On the first day, our instructor told us, "Throw whatever romantic notion you have about the Red Baron straight into the trash. We're not looking for knights. We're looking for engineers, for systems administrators." That difference was decisive. At the start of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had the best pilots in the world. Their aces could feel every shudder of the engine in their bones, but their training system could not scale. When one of their aces was killed, what they lost was an irreplaceable work of art. When one of us got killed, the American war machine would send 3 fully trained replacements within 2 weeks, and every one of them had studied the operating manual and learned to fly by instruments rather than instinct. In advanced flight training, while pilots bound for other theaters were still practicing how to latch onto an enemy's tail for a dogfight, those of us who had been selected began to learn a new concept: strategic bombing. "Your job is not to shoot down enemy fighters," our instructor said, a veteran who had flown B-17s over Europe, jabbing his pointer at the complex formation diagram on the blackboard. "Your job is to put bombs on assigned coordinates and then come home alive." Leave the acrobatics to the escort fighters. You will be operating the most expensive asset this country owns." In early 1943, rumors began to circulate around the base. Boeing, they said, was building a monster out in Seattle, a bomber twice the size of the B-17 with twice the range of the B-24. Some said it was President Roosevelt's personal gamble. Some said it would fly directly across the Pacific. Then one day, I was transferred to Smoky Hill Army Airfield near Salina, Kansas, and saw with my own eyes the huge machine bearing the designation XB-29. Even for someone who understood engineering, I was struck dumb. It sat there on the field, its silver aluminum skin flashing in the sun, a wingspan of 141 feet, stretching out like a blade ready to slice open the sky. It was so sleek, none of the blunt protrusions of a B-17. The nose was a transparent hemisphere, like the giant compound eye of an insect. What shocked me most was not its size, but its smoothness. All the turrets were streamlined, some even retractable. An instructor patted me on the shoulder, awe in his voice. "Reynolds, go take a look inside. No oxygen mask plugs, no leather jackets, it's pressurized. Pressurized cabins." At that time, the word sounded like something out of science fiction. It meant we could cruise at 30,000 feet in khaki shirts, sipping coffee, while outside it was cold enough to split steel. It meant we would live in a comfort zone, beyond the reach of the Japanese. But the machine was anything but tame. It was a premature infant forced into the world for the sake of war. Its heart, the 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone 18-cylinder radial engines, was an engineer's nightmare. They used large amounts of magnesium alloy to save weight, which meant that if a fire broke out, the burning temperature was high enough to melt the main wing spar. "This is the beast we're supposed to ride," my co-pilot, Harry Cohen from Brooklyn, said, staring at the oil streaks on the nacelle. "Either it'll take us to Tokyo or it'll roast us right here on the runway." The B-29 program, at $3 billion, America's largest single war expenditure outside the Manhattan Project, was not just about building an airplane. It was a full-scale test of American industrial capacity. I was fortunate enough to be assigned to the 58th Bombardment Wing, the first unit to be equipped with the B-29. Training in Kansas was brutal, not because of enemy fire, but because the technology itself was so immature. The R3350 had a notorious overheating problem. If you closed the cowl flaps even a little while taxiing, cylinder head temperature would shoot past 260 degrees, and then you were a spark away from an engine fire. We spent more time in simulators than in the air. What we were learning was not how to evade Zero fighters, but how to operate the revolutionary Central Fire Control System. This was General Electric's masterpiece, and the beginning of Japan's nightmare. In earlier bombers, gunners had to crouch behind their guns in open turrets, enduring cold and vibration. In the B-29, apart from the tail gunner, we all sat in a comfortable pressurized cabin, watching through periscopic sights. Each gunner held a pistol grip controller. Once he put the sight's ring over an enemy, an analog computer on board. This was 1943's idea of a computer, automatically calculated lead, drop, wind drift, and parallax, then remotely slewed the turrets and opened fire. "This isn't fair," Harry said after the first training session with the system. "It's like playing a video game." There was no such term then, but that was what he meant. No, it wasn't fair. That was the whole point. They drilled it into us. War is not a joust between knights. War is systems engineering. Our computer could lock onto a fly at 1,000 yards, and Japanese pilots were still estimating trajectories by naked eye. In early 1944, the orders finally came, but not for the Pacific Islands I'd imagined. We were bound for India, Operation Matterhorn. The code name sounded grand, but in execution it was a logistical hell. The strategy was to base B-29s in India, use those as rear bases, then shuttle to forward fields near Chengdu in China, and from there, strike steelworks on Kyushu. Flying the hump, I came to understand for the first time what true high-altitude terror meant. The Himalayas rose below like an unbroken white wall. To clear the peaks and the violent air, we had to climb above 24,000 feet. It was there that I encountered the first interceptors of the Japanese Army Air Force. They were Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters, known to us as Oscar. Down low, they were agile killers. At 25,000 feet, they looked drunk. I watched one on our port side trying to pull its nose up to attack our wingman. Its movements were sluggish. The wings shuddered violently in the thin air. With no turbocharger, the engine was starving, barely enough power to stay level. Our gunners didn't even bother to fire. The Oscar tried a tight turn and simply stalled, spiraling down through the clouds like a dead leaf. "See that?" our navigator said over the interphone. "That's aerodynamics doing the killing." But that was just the prelude. Our real enemy was not the Japanese, but logistics. To stockpile enough fuel for a single strike against Japan, we had to fly that giant bomber back and forth across the hump 7 times, using it like a transport. It was an insult to the B-29 as a high-tech weapon. On June 15, 1944, came a historic day. We took off from Chengdu, bound for the Yawata Steelworks on Kyushu. Not since Doolittle's raid had U.S. bombers struck the Japanese home islands. It was a long, exhausting flight. As we approached Kyushu, the radar operator reported a swarm of returns ahead. Bandits at 12 o'clock, altitude 26,000. This time it wasn't just aging Oscars. We ran into Ki-45 Toryu, Nick, twin-engine heavy fighters, built specifically to kill bombers. I tightened my grip on the yoke, feeling the vibration from the 4 R-335Os. We held our altitude at 27,000 feet. A knife-edge height. It was near the practical ceiling of a loaded B-29, but in the dead zone for most Japanese fighters. Through the side window, I watched a Toryu clawing upwards, trying to gain position. The pilot was clearly experienced, using the clouds to mask his climb and spiral up, but I could see his predicament. Up here, air density was only a third of sea level. His engines were panting. The slightest control input cost him precious energy. Every time he tried to raise the nose, the airframe shuddered. "He's drowning," Harry said coldly. "Look at him, like he's trying to climb a glass wall coated in grease." Eventually, the Toryu managed to reach our altitude, but he had no energy left to attack. He hung there with his nose slightly up, and for a brief moment, he flew alongside us. I could almost picture his face in that cockpit, staring in despair at this vast silver formation, at us sliding past as steady as spacecraft, while his own airplane shook itself apart. Then our turrets moved. The motion was mechanical, emotionless. General Electric's fire control computer had locked onto a target that was barely moving. Bra, 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 bra. Not a wild spray, but precise bursts. The Toryu's left wing snapped clean off and caught fire. He made no evasive move. He couldn't. At this altitude, he was like a fly stuck to flypaper. The Yawata raid, however, was a failure. The high-altitude jet stream, something meteorologists of the day barely understood, scattered our bombs. Most fell on open ground. And once again, the R3350S turned killer. Our wingman had to force land in the Chinese mountains when an engine overheated beyond control. Still, the mission proved one thing. Japan's home island defenses had an inherent weakness against fast, high-altitude targets. Their radar was backward, their flak couldn't reach, and their fighters were built for low-altitude dogfights, not stratospheric interception. In the fall of 1944, the situation changed fundamentally. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell to the Marines. For us, that meant everything. No more hump, no more counting oil drops on muddy Chinese strips. From the Marianas, Tokyo lay just 1,500 miles away, the perfect radius for a B-29. As our wing redeployed from India to Saipan, I saw from the air the miracle they called Isley Field. Months earlier, it had been jungle and cane fields. Now, the Seabees had laid down 2 of the longest runways on Earth with crushed coral, each 8,500 feet long and 200 feet wide. The runways were packed with B-29s, silver fuselages forming an aluminum sea under the tropical sun. I had never seen such a sight. It was American industrial power made visible. Behind every airplane stood thousands of workers, immense supply chains, and a will that refused to stop. There we met the new commander of 21st Bomber Command, Brigadier General Haywood Hansel. He was a true believer in high-altitude precision bombing. "We're going to destroy Japan's aircraft industry," Hansel told us in the briefing room, his eyes burning with conviction. "From 30,000 feet, we will drop bombs straight into Nakajima's engine plants. We will cut their veins." At that point, we still believed the theory. After all, that was what we had been trained for. The Norden bomb site had been praised as able to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel. We believed technology would solve everything. But Japan was not entirely helpless. As we drew closer to Tokyo, new opponents appeared. The intel officer laid out some grainy photos taken near Iwo Jima. "Pay attention to this one," he said, pointing. Kai-61 Hien, Allied reporting name Tony, Japan's only liquid-cooled fighter, looks a lot like the German Messerschmitt. And this, Kai-44 Shoki Tojo, very high rate of climb. Lately we've heard of a new type, Ki-84 Hayate Frank. Supposedly excellent performance. I gave a skeptical laugh. Excellent where? Down at sea level? "Don't underestimate them, Major," the intel officer said, reading my face. "The Japanese have their backs to the wall. They've deployed their elite 10th Flying Division to the home islands. To reach you, they're stripping armor from their planes, tearing out radios, even peeling off the paint to save weight. They're madmen. Stripping off armor in a sky filled with 50 caliber bullets." It was madness, but that was the enemy we were dealing with. Not rational soldiers, but fanatics willing to ignore physics in defense of their emperor. By early November 1944, on Saipan, we were making final preparations. Mechanics worked around the clock on the temperamental R3350S, changing cylinders, checking turbochargers. Ground crews packed our cavernous bomb bays with 500-pound high explosive bombs. I knew something big was coming. The date was set for November 24th, 1944. Codename San Antonio 1. It would be the first time since 1942 that U.S. aircraft appeared over Tokyo. This time, it would not be a symbolic raid. This would be the beginning of destruction. We were going to pound at the heart of the Japanese Empire and see whether our high-altitude fortress was truly invulnerable. The night before takeoff, I walked alone out onto the ramp. In the moonlight, the Superfortress looked cold and severe. I laid my hand on the chilled aluminum skin as if I could feel the immense power caged inside. I thought of the stress and strength calculations we'd done back in class at Caltech. I thought of Japanese houses made of wood and paper, their fighters without self-sealing tanks. This was an asymmetric war. We were invaders from the future, riding pressurized ships to pass judgment on a civilization still living in the past. What I didn't know then was that the winds over Tokyo were fiercer than anything we'd planned for, and the desperate fury of Japanese pilots would surpass all the scenarios we had imagined. November 24th, 1944, before dawn. Easley Field, Saipan. The air reeked of high-octane aviation gasoline. That sharp smell was the cologne of war. Palm trees along the runway stirred in the tropical breeze, but the illusion of calm shattered when hundreds of R-3350s roared to life. The ground shook. It was the rumble of the earth, the roar of industrial civilization. Operation San Antonio 1. Our destination, Tokyo. Until then, we had only circled on the periphery. This time we were going to kick down the Emperor's front door. 111 B-29 Superfortresses of the 73rd Bombardment Wing stood queued for takeoff. Leading the formation was Brigadier General Emmett Rosie O'Donnell in the now famous Dauntless Dottie. I sat in the left seat of Lady Luck, palms slightly damp. Not from fear of the enemy, but from respect for a fully loaded B-29's temperament. With tanks brimmed to reach Tokyo and return, and bomb bays stuffed full, our gross weight was an incredible 135,000 pounds. "Co-pilot, give me engine readings," I said over the interphone. "Number 1 and 4, cylinder heads at 240. Number 2, running a bit hot at 255. Turbo boost normal." Harry's voice was tight. Takeoff was the most dangerous moment for a B-29. At the far end of that 8,500-foot coral runway lay nothing but cliff and ocean. If we didn't build enough speed by then, the 60-ton aluminum can we sat in would drop into the sea like a giant depth charge. Brakes off, throttles full forward. We began to crawl, then gather speed. The 4 engines screamed, the whole airframe shaking. The airspeed needle crept up. 80 knots, 100, 120. The cliff at the end of the runway rushed toward us. V1, V2, rotate. In the final few hundred feet, the lumbering beast finally broke free of gravity, raising its nose with painful reluctance. As we skimmed over the cliff edge, I could almost see the white froth of waves crashing against the rocks. The thump of the gear retracting came through the floor. We were airborne and still alive. The next hours were a monotonous climb. We had to work our way to 30,000 feet. As the altimeter needle turned, the sky outside faded from pale blue to dark blue, then to that solemn black violet. At 25,000 feet, I flipped on the pressurization. It was a moment that still feels miraculous. In a B-17, at this height we would already be in heavy oxygen masks and heated suits, our eyebrows crusted with ice, fighting headache and hypoxia. In the B-29, I wore my light khaki Air Forces shirt, top button undone. Cabin pressure stayed at the equivalent of 8,000 feet, temperature a comfortable 20 degrees Celsius. I unscrewed my thermos and poured a cup of coffee. Steam rose gently. "Hey, Harry," I said, raising the cup. "A toast to the engineers at Boeing." He grinned and pointed out the window. "To them. Out there, that coffee wouldn't even hit the ground before it froze solid." Outside, it was minus 55. That was a kill zone for life, and we had brought a warm bubble into it. We were like office workers in Manhattan, commuting across an ocean to carry out a mass killing. Chapter 6. The Invisible River. As we neared the coast of Japan, that iconic cone, Mount Fuji, speared through the cloud deck. Its snow-capped summit looked pure and solemn against the violet sky. "Beautiful," the navigator murmured over the interphone. Shame we're here to bomb the factories next to it. Our target was the Musashino Aircraft Works in northwest Tokyo, the heart of Nakajima's plant network, the heart of Japan's aviation industry. But as we crossed the Izu Peninsula and lined up on the bombing run, something went wrong. "Skipper, this doesn't make sense," the navigator said, suddenly anxious. "Our ground speed? Jesus, our ground speed is 450 knots. What? We're only doing 250 indicated. It's the wind. One hell of a wind." We had run headlong into what would later be known as the jet stream. In that era, meteorology knew almost nothing about such high-altitude rivers of air. Now, at 30,000 feet, a west wind blowing at 140 knots, over 260 kilometers an hour, was carrying us like a leaf in a flood. With it behind us, we hurtled along like artillery shells. If we turned into it, we might as well be swimming through glue. Worse, the Norden bombsight had no idea what to do with such madness. A marvel of optics, though it was supposed to be, its gears and cams could not cope with that kind of drift. Our bombardier had to crank the sight to absurd angles to keep the crosshairs on target. And even then, the airplane crabbed sideways like a crab in a rapid. "Can't lock the target. We're moving too damn fast," he shouted. In the chaos, the radar operator broke in. "Bandits, multiple returns dead ahead, low, climbing." The Guardians of the Empire had arrived. Chapter 7. Dancers on the Edge. If you want to understand what a gap in technology looks like, you would have to stand under the Tokyo sky on that day in November 1944. We were up against the Japanese Army's 10th Flying Division, the Heaven Shaker Division, equipped with Japan's best interceptors, Kai-44, Shoki, and Kai-61 Hien. Through the plexiglass on my left side, I looked down. Some 3,000 feet below, a cluster of silver dots was struggling upward. Those were Shokis, short, stubby fuselages wrapped around massive engines. They had been designed as point defense interceptors, little rockets meant to spear bombers. But here, in the rarefied air at 30,000 feet, they looked more like drowning men. One Shoki went for General O'Donnell's lead ship, Dauntless Dottie. The pilot clearly knew his trade. He pulled his nose up, trying to make a sharp climbing attack. At 15,000 feet, that might have worked. At 30,000, it was suicide. I watched the airplane shudder violently as he pulled. The wings lost their lift. The propeller spun uselessly in the thin air, biting into nothing. It wasn't flying. It was physics passing judgment. The Shoki ran out of energy a good 2,000 feet below us. The nose drooped, and then it fell into a vicious spin, dropping like a stone. "Look, a Hien," Harry called. A Kai-61 was closing from our 2 o'clock. A handsome airplane, slim-bodied, like a German Bf-109, and like it, powered by a liquid-cooled engine. Out here, at 50 below, that was a death sentence. The Hien clawed its way up to our altitude, but every movement was stiff. No muzzle flashes came from its cannons. We learned later that the gun lubricants had frozen at that temperature, locking the bolts solid. The poor bastard had fought his way up to us, only to find that he was holding a stick. And us? Central Fire Control. Assume control of all turrets. Our gunner sat in the warm, pressurized cabin, hands resting on the control handles like a machinist at a lathe. He eased the controller, slipped the light ring around the sluggish Hien. All 4 twin .50 caliber turrets on the fuselage swiveled together. The analog computer did the wind, the gravity, the relative speeds in a heartbeat. Zzz, zzz. No deafening roar, only the quiet hum of electric motors and a new vibration through the structure. 4 streams of fire wove into a lattice. The Hien had no chance to jink. At this altitude, any violent maneuver would send it into a stall. It could only hold a straight line. The .50 caliber AP incendiary rounds sliced its fragile wings as if they were paper. Fuel poured from the unprotected tanks and ignited. An orange fireball blossomed in the violet sky. The airplane came apart, fragments scattering into the stratospheric wind. "This is a slaughterhouse," I muttered. It wasn't a fight. That Japanese pilot had spent thousands of hours earning his skill, and against the crystallized might of our industry, he might as well have charged a tank with a sword. Our pressurized cabins, our turbocharged engines, our fire control computers, all together, they formed an invisible wall of steel. The Japanese weren't shot down by our courage. They were shot down by the limits of their own industry. But not all of them chose to give up. When technology could no longer close the gap, human will or madness took the stage. Just after we had dropped our bombs, most of which, thanks to the wild wind, fell into fields rather than on factories, and turned for home, I saw something I will never forget. In the rear of the formation, a B-29 we knew as Irish Lassie was being shadowed by a Key 45 Tor U. That twin-engine fighter had clearly been modified to extremes. It did not fire, or its guns were frozen too. It simply staggered along at our altitude like a drunk, but it did not leave. "What's he doing?" Harry asked. "Has he lost his mind?" The Toryu began to accelerate. Not by engine power, it tipped into a shallow dive, trading altitude for speed, then pulled up at a calculated point. It was not trying to shoot. It had turned itself into a bullet. I watched that silver dart drive straight into Irish Lassie's right wing. No dramatic fireball, just the nightmare of structure failing. Half the B-29's massive right wing sheared clean away. The Toryu disintegrated at the same instant. Irish Lassie rolled over into a wild tumble. For a moment I could see her cockpit, that pressurized refuge, warm and safe, full of coffee smell just like mine, burst open. A burst of white vapor, cabin air flashing into fog in the sudden decompression, erupted outward. The men inside were probably unconscious from lack of oxygen before they even felt the impact. 60 tons of metal came apart in the air, taking 11 American boys down with it toward Tokyo Bay, 27,000 feet below. The radios went dead. This was the Shinton Seiku Tai, the heaven-shaking air superiority unit, a special ramming force formed to crash into B-29s. They stripped their planes of armor, radios, even guns, just to scrape up enough performance to reach our altitude and strike our aluminum fortresses with their own bodies. A chill went through me, one that had nothing to do with the cold outside. We had won the technical war. The B-29 was a masterpiece of engineering, and our defenses seemed impregnable. But against men who took death as a matter of routine, men willing to trade their one certain last impact for our broken wing, all our calculations felt suddenly fragile. "Close it up. Tight formations," O'Donnell's voice crackled over the radio, harsh with strain. "Don't give them single targets." The flight home felt endless. The Japanese fighters we hadn't knocked down with the computer still circled our trail like sharks scenting blood. They flew with difficulty, pistons wheezing, but if even one of them managed another ram like that, we were finished. I gripped the yoke until my knuckles went white, eyes flicking over the instruments that represented the pinnacle of modern technology. Cabin pressure normal, cylinder head temperatures normal, fire control radar normal. All that precision gave me comfort, but I couldn't shake the image of that disintegrating B-29. I knew we had only opened the first page. Tokyo's defenses might be backward in technology, but in will, they were turning into something like wild animals. We had lifted the lid off of Pandora's box. We had humiliated them with technology, and they had chosen to answer with the rawest, bloodiest weapon of all. Back on Saipan that night, there was no celebration. The mission report said completed. We had dropped tens of tons of bombs on Tokyo, but every face was gray. In the club, we drank warm beer. Harry sat beside me, turning his lighter between his fingers. "Tom," he said quietly, "did you see him? The guy in that plane that hit them. He didn't even try to bail out." I nodded and took a long pull. They didn't have parachutes. To reach that height, they threw the chutes out to save weight. Harry was silent for a long time, then said, "This isn't a war. This is something else. We're fighting ghosts." Ghosts. That night on my cot, whenever I shut my eyes, I saw that violet sky, those silver shapes thrashing in thin air, and that single, irrevocable impact. We had thought that with the height and speed of the B-29, we could play gods, striking from the clouds untouched by mortal hands. The Japanese were telling us that if you drive mortals into a corner, they become demons that climb up and drag gods down into hell. And that was only November of 1944. Worse firestorms, more insane ramming attacks, and the ultimate LeMay fire raids were still waiting ahead. By January 1945, the winds over the Marianas had shifted, not only in the weather but in command. General Haywood Hansell was gone, the idealist who believed in high-altitude precision bombing and hoped to spare civilians by hitting only factories had been relieved by Washington. His replacement as head of 21st Bomber Command was Major General Curtis LeMay. If Hansell was a professor, LeMay was a butcher. He always had a cigar clamped between his teeth, his eyes as hard as granite. He had no time for doctrine. He cared about results, and the results were dismal. At 30,000 feet, the jet stream had reduced our missions to near futility. Less than 10% of our bombs were landing in target areas. LeMay's first order hit the briefing room like an earthquake. "Strip out all your defensive guns," he said around his cigar, voice low and rough. "Leave the tail turret. Everything else, guns, ammunition, gunners, stays on this island." For a moment, there was a stunned silence, then an explosion of protest. "Sir," a squadron commander shot to his feet, "those guns are the only thing keeping us alive. Without central fire control, those high-end fighters will tear us apart." LeMay stared him down, unblinking. "The Japanese have no effective night fighters. We're going to hit them at night." "At night?" "That's right, and not at 30,000 feet. He paused, then dropped the real bomb. "We're going down to between 5 and 8,000. I felt the room tilt. Under the table, Harry kicked my shin. His face had gone pale. To men who had grown used to the B-29's element, it was insanity. The Superfortress was built to live in the high, thin air. Up there, it was nearly untouchable. At 5,000 feet, that was the happy zone for light flak. Even rifles could reach. It was like driving a priceless precision instrument into the enemy's trench like a truck. "Forget the flak," LeMay said, as if reading our thoughts. "Down there, at that speed, there's no jet stream. Without guns and ammo, each of you can carry 2 extra tons of bombs. And we're not dropping high explosives anymore. We're dropping M69 incendiaries." He pointed at the map of Tokyo behind him. The teeming districts of wooden houses were marked in red. "We're going to burn it. Not a single factory. We're going to burn the city. We'll destroy their cottage industry, torch every paper-walled house where some worker sits turning out screws for the emperor. This isn't combat, it's pest control." Walking out of the briefing, my gut churned. As an engineer, I understood the cold logic. Japanese industry was dispersed, like capillaries through the body of its cities. To cut the blood, you had to burn the flesh. As a human, I knew what it meant. We would stop being sharpshooters at military targets. We were about to become arsonists. For a week, the ground crews went at our airplanes like madmen. The central fire control system I had been so proud of, that pinnacle of electronic ingenuity, was ripped out with brute force. Computers, sights, turrets, all piled like scrap at the edge of the ramp. The empty fuselage gave me a strange feeling of nakedness. Yes, we'd saved nearly 1.5 tons of weight. We had also stripped away our psychological tech shield. In its place came bundles of ominous tubes, M69 incendiary clusters. Another masterpiece of American industry, or the devil of chemical engineering. Not a crater maker, but a cluster bomb. Every 500-pound casing was packed with 38 hexagonal sticks. Inside them was not explosive, but a newly invented gelled gasoline, napalm. I saw them demonstrated at the armory. Once that gummy stuff touched anything, it would not let go. It burned at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The nastiest part was the delayed action fuse. The canister punched through a roof, slammed into the floor, and only then, seconds later, spewed fire, so the fire started inside the house. "This stuff is tailor-made for Japan," the ordnance officer said, slapping a bundle. "Their cities are stacks of kindling. All we have to do is strike the match." On March 9th, 1945, came Operation Meeting House. We were going to a conference in Tokyo. This time, takeoff felt utterly different. Without the weight of turrets and ammo, even laden with maximum fuel and bombs, the airplane felt unnervingly light. More importantly, we no longer had to claw our way into the killing cold above. But that did nothing for my nerves. We were going low. "Harry, check the radar." "N/APQ-13 is up and happy, Skipper." Radar was our new eye. At night, the Norden was blind. We would use radar beams to trace coastlines and city outlines. It was yet another field where Japan could not follow. Their sets barely saw large swaths of airspace. Ours could sketch a shoreline. As we approached the home islands, the night was black as ink. The altimeter read 5,000. The air down here was thick and damp. The engines no longer needed full turbo boost. They droned easily. I felt none of the icy safety of 30,000 feet. From here, I could actually pick out fishing boats' lights on the sea. "We're getting into the hot tub," Harry muttered. Ahead, the first wave of Pathfinders had arrived. They carried the best radar and the best crews. Their job wasn't to bomb. It was to light the fuse. Even from dozens of miles away, I saw what they did. On the dark sprawl of Tokyo, 2 huge crossing lines of fire suddenly appeared. That was the napalm, laid down in the Shitamachi district, the most densely populated wooden slum on Earth, tracing out a giant X. Target confirmed. Turning onto the bomb run. Just as LeMay had predicted, Japan's air defenses collapsed under this new tactic. Searchlights swung wildly. They were used to probing 30,000 feet. By the time they realized the bombers were prowling just a few thousand feet overhead, like giant bats, everything was out of alignment. The flak was heavy, but without proper fire control, it was mostly wild. Even the small, quick-firing guns could not keep up with our 300-mile-an-hour dash. As for the Japanese night fighters I had feared, I saw a few flickers on radar, and here and there the glow of Ki-45 exhaust pipes. But without ground radar to direct them, hunting black B-29s in a black sky was like searching for a black cat in a coal bin. Even when a fighter stumbled on us, it faced a cruel problem. At this low altitude, the B-29 was fast, and without any altitude to trade, the Toryu had a hard time catching us. We didn't need guns. Speed and darkness were our armor. Open bomb bay doors. The airplane lurched as tons of M69s dropped free, but I barely had time to think where they would fall, because the real horror began. Convection. Below, there was no longer a fire. It was a firestorm. Tens of thousands of tons of napalm igniting square mile after square mile of wood and paper. The inferno sucked oxygen at such a rate that cool air rushed in all around, turning into 100-mile-an-hour winds at ground level, feeding towering columns of hot air. Flying over it, I felt as if a massive hand had seized the airplane and flung us upwards. "Hold her! Hold her!" I yelled, veins bulging in my arms as I fought the yoke. The B-29 bucked and shuddered, airframe groaning in a way that set my teeth on edge. For a moment, I truly thought the wings would snap, not from flak, but from the hell we had lit underneath. When I wrestled her back under control and glanced down, my soul went cold. I had never seen anything like it, and I hope I never will again. All of Shitamachi had become a lake of boiling lava. The red X was gone, swallowed by an endless orange sea. Even at this altitude, through a sealed hull, I could smell it. It was a stench of burning wood, melting asphalt, and some scorched organic thing. The smell of death. "Oh God!" The navigator retched over the interphone. By the light of the flames, I could see details. The Sumida River was boiling, literally boiling. Thousands of tiny black dots, people, were trying to throw themselves into the water, but the river itself had been cooked. Japanese flak still burst blindly, but compared to the hell on the ground, those puffs were nothing. We were a conveyor belt in the sky. Every few dozen seconds, another B-29 turned in, dumped its load of fire, pulled up, and vanished into the dark. For 3 solid hours, 300 B-29s, 1,665 tons of incendiaries. On the way home, the cabin was tomb quiet. No one spoke, no celebration. Harry, who usually had a joke for everything, stared at the instruments in a daze. We landed in daylight. Ground crews ran toward us. Then they stopped, faces twisting. Puzzled, I climbed down and looked back. Lady Luck, once a bright, shining symbol of America's industrial pride, was black. Not with oil, but with soot blown up from Tokyo. Ash clung to the belly, clogged the cooling fins. A young mechanic reached out, wiped a smear from the wing, raised his fingers to his nose, then doubled over coughing, his face gone white. "Major," he asked, voice shaking, "what is that smell?" I looked at him, barely more than a boy. I almost told him it was the smell of victory, the smell of a war about to end. Instead, I just waved a hand, bone-tired. "Wash the plane. We're going to Nagoya tonight." Yes, again. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. General LeMay had a long list. Once the machine of industry started, it did not stop. The sun shone. The sea breeze was soft that morning on Saipan. I felt cold. Not the cold of 30,000 feet, but something that had settled into my chest. By May 1945, the war had changed once more. Tokyo was a charred plain, but our sorties continued. We were ordered to destroy every last place that might hide industrial capacity. Just when we thought Japanese air power had finally bled out, it flared one last time. On a daylight mission in May, our target was airfields on Kyushu. Crossing the Bungo Strait, the radar showed not the usual chaotic scatter, but a handful of fast, tight formations. "Heads up, fighters, they're moving fast." They were N1K2J Shidenkai, George. If the old Zero was a fragile toy, and the Shoki a rough rocket, then the Shidenkai was a true masterpiece. Built by Kawanishi, it was the Navy's last sword. Automatic combat flaps, 420mm cannon, maneuverable enough to mix it with Mustangs down low. Higher up, we also met Ki 84 Hayate, Frank, the fighter Intel had warned us about, a 400-mile-an-hour machine with armor to match. That day, I watched a dogfight that made my blood run cold. 2 Shidenkai burst from a cloud straight at our P-51Ds, 15th Fighter Group escorts. Normally, this would be a slaughter in the Mustangs' favor. It was their hunting season. But not this time. The 2 dark green Japanese fighters rolled with astonishing crispness, their automatic flaps biting the air. They carved impossibly tight turns and managed to latch onto a Mustang's tail. Wham! 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 4 20mm guns spoke. The P-51's wings snapped and spun away, the airplane corkscrewing into the sea. "Christ, where did those guys come from?" Harry blurted. They were from the famous 343rd Naval Air Group, the Tsurugi Squadron. Under Captain Minoru Genda, Japan had gathered its surviving aces and given them its finest machines, hoping for a last-minute reversal of fortune. Yet that flash of excellence was over in moments. Less than a minute after the Shidenkai bagged the Mustang, its engine belched black smoke and its speed dropped, not from hits, but from fuel. Japan had no more high-octane gasoline. No matter how well designed the engine, if it drank synthetic junk distilled from pine roots, it could not deliver. Detonation, carbon fouling, failing pistons, it was doomed. I watched that Shidenkai, which could have ruled any sky, sag like a wounded eagle, only to be shredded seconds later by 3 swarming P-51s. That was late-war Japan in miniature. They had finally built machines that could match ours. They had gathered pilots with iron wills, but their industrial bloodstream was dry. No fuel, no spares, no new pilots trained to replace the dead. Watching those 2 Shidenkai fall, I felt a deep sadness, not pity, but an engineer's sorrow at a pure technical achievement crushed by a failed system. By July 1945, we were back on Tinian. The atmosphere was strange. At one corner of North Field, barbed wire sealed off a compound. Inside was a mysterious unit, the 509 Composite Group. Their commander was Colonel Paul Tibbets. They did not mix with us ordinary bomber crews, and their airplanes were different. One day, I drove a jeep past the fence and saw the B-29s on their ramp. "Look at that, Harry," I pointed. "No turrets." Apart from the tail gun, those fuselages were bare, every remote turret gone. Stranger still, they had Curtiss Electric reversible pitch propellers, and the bomb bay racks had been modified into a single huge hook. They called it the silver plate configuration. "What are they doing? Flying cargo?" Harry guessed. "Cargo outfits don't get that level of secrecy." I shook my head. "And look at their training flights, those big, sharp diving turns. They're practicing some kind of escape maneuver." Rumors raced around the island. Gas warfare, some kind of super heavy bomb. One night in the club, I ran into an old classmate from Caltech. He was a technical officer with the 509th now, drunk and terrified. "Tom," he said, clutching my sleeve, his voice shaking, "if that thing works, we won't have to fly again. Not just us. Maybe nobody will ever need pilots again." "What thing? What are you talking about?" He pointed up at the ceiling, then down at the floor. "The sun. We're going to drop the sun." I thought he was babbling drunk. Until August 6th, 1945, early morning, Colonel Tibbets took off in a B-29 named after his mother, Enola Gay. As a senior officer in the 73rd, I was assigned to fly a reconnaissance aircraft in a safe area some distance from Hiroshima to observe weather and, afterward, the effects. It was a clear, heartbreakingly beautiful morning. Hiroshima lay peaceful below. The delta of the Ota River shimmered in the sun. Radar showed no Japanese fighters. They were used to seeing single B-29s or small flights in daylight by then, usually just reconnaissance. No reason to scramble. 8:15 a.m. I was writing in the log when the world lost its color. It didn't go dark. It went white. A white beyond anything the eye is meant to see. Pure, absolute, overwhelming. It burned through my goggles, through my eyelids, as if it were shining directly on my retina. Then silence. A silence, like the death of sound itself. "What was that?" my co-pilot yelled. When our vision cleared and we turned toward Hiroshima, we saw the most terrifying and strangest sight in human history. A huge fireball boiled there, not the orange of normal flame, but violet and white and gold, the colors of a star's interior. A thick, gray-white column punched upward, rising so fast it seemed determined to pierce the sky. At its top, cloud rolled and billowed outward, forming a perfect, monstrous mushroom. That cloud climbed to 40,000 feet, higher than we were flying. Just as we stared, the shock wave hit. Even at our distance, the invisible hand slammed the aircraft like a toy. The 60-ton bomber bucked like a leaf, the airframe shrieking. "Hold her! That's the blast wave, damn it!" When I got her steady and looked down again, Hiroshima was gone. Truly gone. The streets, docks, factories we had clearly seen minutes before were buried under roiling smoke and dust. The city center was a black hole, rings of devastation radiating outward. As an engineer, I understood immediately. This was not chemistry, not TNT. This was mass becoming energy. E equals mc squared made flesh. In that moment, all our industrial crushing felt like child's play. We had used thousands of B-29 sorties and tens of thousands of tons of incendiaries to burn a city. The 509th had used one airplane, one bomb, and a second. "The war is over," I whispered, my hands trembling. "But it's more than that. The old world is over." 3 days later, Nagasaki saw the same. Whatever stubbornness was left in the Japanese leadership was shattered by this power from the heart of the universe. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The battleship Missouri lay at anchor on a flat, quiet sea. On her deck, Japan's foreign minister Shigemitsu, dragging a crippled leg, signed the instrument of surrender. We of the 20th Air Force received our last task, a fly past. It was a bright morning, just like the one at Pearl Harbor, only now the sky was ours. I flew Lady Luck on the right flank of a colossal formation. It may have been the most powerful air armada in history. As we roared low over Tokyo Bay, the thunder of engines shook the water. That sound was victory itself. Through the window, I took my last long look at the land below. Yokohama, Kawasaki, Tokyo, the once crowded industrial belt, was an endless spread of rubble and charred ruins. Here and there, a few Japanese survivors stood on the wreckage, raising their heads to watch us. I thought of the Japanese pilots who had died in Oscars over the Himalayas, of those in stripped-down Toryuu fighters ramming our bombers, of the ace in a Shidenkai who fell into the sea because there was no gasoline fit for his engine. Were they brave? No question. Did they have skill? In the end, their engineers proved their talent too. But as I looked down from 3,000 feet at that flattened land, I knew what this war had really been. It was never a duel between samurai and cowboys. It was Detroit's assembly lines against Kyoto's craft shops, Standard Oil's cracking towers against pine root fuel, MIT's laboratories against a culture that tried to turn willpower into a weapon. We did not win because we were braver. We won because we turned war into a math problem and possessed all the resources needed to solve it. We built sealed, pressurized cabins they could not reach. We built fire control computers that made their agility useless. We built atomic bombs that rendered their will to resist meaningless. I eased back on the yoke. Lady Luck lifted her nose and headed east, back toward the far shore of the Pacific, toward an America of neon lights, gigantic factories, and an open-ended future. Behind us, over the ruins, the rising sun flag came down slowly. An age ended. In the new age, victory would no longer belong to the sharpest sword, but to the loudest factory and the quietest laboratory. I am Thomas Reynolds, former B-29 pilot. This is what we saw from 30,000 feet.